This is the Anarchist Handbook on 90.3 KDBS. You're listening to the Anarchist Handbook on 90.3 KDVS with your host, Clay Norris. Today I have a special guest. I have Professor Scott Shershow. He's a professor of English and the chair of the Davis Faculty Association. Go ahead and say hi, Scott.
Hello.
So today, the first issue I wanted to bring up is one which seems to be outside of the typical popular political discourse. What I do hear from both sides of the political parties is that unemployment needs to end and that either side seems to have the right answer for curing unemployment or ending unemployment and bringing unemployment to a lower level. And I have some odds with this because I find that given today's modern society with automation and high production and high efficiency, that unemployment will seem to never go away and that, if anything, it's going to rise, especially as the population rises. So what I wanted to address today is how society might become maybe more accommodating or more sympathetic to those who are unemployed and what we might be able to do with the people that will end up being eventually unemployed as they, reach adult years or lose the jobs that they once had. Oh, yeah. So, Scott, in any of your studies or any of your writings, have you really sort of advanced any thoughts on this issue?
Yes. Well, in my book, The Work and the Gift, which was published some time ago, it's getting to be, I guess, about 8 years ago. And so, in fact, maybe the times will seem to have changed. But I didn't so much argue in my own voice, but surveyed a whole range of thinkers, really on both the right and the left, throughout the 20th century that worried about a coming crisis of work, which would really involve not having enough jobs to give everyone one in a kind of structural sense. Well, what my book is, you might say, mostly about, or my own argument, is that we still have these sort of ethical, psychological, and other narratives in which work is always said to be sort of necessary. I don't mean necessary because things have to get done. I mean necessary for the psychological health of an individual. Mm-hmm. And so we both talk about work as a curse, as in the scriptural phrase, or a necessity, something that we need to do because life needs things. But on the other hand, we talk about it as another kind of necessity. And so my argument would be, at least let's get straight on that and say that work is only necessary to the point that it is necessary. And now I do mean because obviously some things have to get done. So a sophisticated and complex society, it's true, one would have to assume that a certain amount of work is going to have to always be done, even in some sort of science fiction future where there is even more robot automation or whatever.
Right.
But we let us only do what is necessary, and rather than on the same time, I call it the double necessity of work, saying that, but whether or not it's really anything needs to be done, you have to work because work is good for your soul or your psyche.
Yeah.
If we could at least say, no, our value should be, let's let ourselves work as little as possible. To be sure, that won't probably be zero because there's a lot that has to be done.
Yeah. And
this would, finally, become a Marxist argument. I mean, Marx argued, there's a famous unfinished passage where he famously speaks of the task of civilization is to wrest freedom from necessity. And he says at the end of this passage that just breaks off, the shortening of the working day.
Yes.
That's the basic prerequisite for freedom. Less work, as little work as possible.
Yeah, and this would leave us to, say we did want to keep ourselves busy somehow or entertained, we would think many of us would find things to do outside of work. But even regarding the things that we would consider work or jobs, there sure are some meaningful things, new jobs that we can create, say jobs that make our communities safer or more environmentally sustainable, things like that. But it seems like even, say, like green jobs will eventually just end more jobs, even though that's a goal we want to have to create green jobs now. It seems as though that will continue to make society more efficient and to need less labor. And so, yeah, it seems as though
yes,
jobs in general require a lot of, energy and some carbon burning. So we can't just have jobs forever that could continually get us to drive to work or get us to produce things that are made in factories or whichever. And
yes. Well, I think that in a highly particular way, and now we would be no longer really, despite the fact that, as we know, Republicans use the word socialism for anything that is even the slightest bit progressive, but in any realistic or rigorous sense of the word, we would not now be talking about socialism, but even in a kind of liberal, mainstream democratic perspective, I think President Obama could have done far more as a stimulus package, which would include a jobs program. Mm-hmm. And that might be, that's, of course, the New Deal. That's putting people to work. Here in California, we're very aware of it since so many of the highways and the national parks were actually done as works projects during the Depression. So here you put people to work, you stimulated the economy because they have salaries and money to spend, and you get things done that are well worth doing, like national parks. So to me, I have no problem with that kind of traditional, liberal, progressive politics, as far as it goes. And I think Obama could have gone farther even with that without in any way calling for anything all that radical.
Yeah, I think Paul Krugman has been one of the advocates of a jobs bill, or at least a bulkier type of, I don't want to call it a bailout, but a bulkier stimulus spending package.
Yes, that's right. He thought that there should have been much more of a stimulus package at first. And I agree. And as much as I certainly support so-called Obamacare, but maybe wait a little while, maybe do that the second year and start with stimulus, which he did do up to a point.
I know what you mean.
There just could have been much more. I do think it's worth pointing out, too, that anyone who really realistically looks at the capitalist system, and again, I don't mean Marxists here, I mean people within it, business thinkers, that system cannot tolerate 100% employment. And, the Wall Street sees, this seems like not a threat right now because we're worried about unemployment. But if there are in moments when the unemployment rate drops too low, that actually is a red flag from within capitalism, sort of business decisions in certain ways. Marx's idea, of course, which seems to me to be, in fact, the case, that the unemployed are, what he famously called a reserve army, so that there's always people available to take jobs, which exerts a downward pressure on wages and so forth.
Yes, yeah. I had a discussion about this recently with some friends, and we were talking about this whether or not figures like Steve Jobs, how important they are for companies or how important they are for innovation or whatnot. And the discussion was turning towards Steve Jobs is important, but don't discount every Chinese worker at the factories either.
Yes.
And it's they can be replaced. And I think, so can Steve Jobs, even though he's important for the company. I think we can't just discount the worker merely because there's a desperate person right behind them.
Yes. And, I agree that, again, not to speak ill of the dead, but that when Steve Jobs died, and again, some of the discourse about him seemed to me excessive.
Yes.
He is a marketeer, it seems to me. A very, very good one, but that's what he is. He's not really making anything much. And I heard someone say, for example, Steve Jobs knew what we wanted before we knew.
Oh, God.
And I thought, well, no, he didn't. He guessed what we wanted, and then he marketed it to us very successfully to the point that we felt that we wanted it. But let's not, at least, again, that's fine, as far as it goes, but let's not delude ourselves that it's anything but that.
Yeah, I mean, we might want products that play our music and allow us to, access the internet, but these aren't Steve Jobs specific things that we wouldn't have ever asked for beforehand, or if he hadn't existed or something. And
in fact, as we well know, there's been a good deal of discussion about it, that the conditions in factories have not always been what we would hope. And yes, there is that vast, new, it's been talked about a lot, new sort of electronic proletariat, people making iPads and iPhones and so forth, as well as doing all the other minutiae of electronics, such as data entry and all that. So that in a way, electronics has created, you might say, a new whole realm of rather menial labor. Could be argued.
Yeah, it's the labor is alongside, machines and computers that are automated. So it's taking that kind of form. and which is, I guess, is how they're rationalizing the low pay and the boring work, is because, well, if we don't have the people there, and then we'll just try to keep automating it until then. But until then, we'll have people sort of alongside this automated process. And it seems like the goal of most companies anyway, it's not because they're evildoers, but it seems like the goal is to continue to further automate as much as possible anyway. So while our populations increase and automation increases, the unemployment would naturally increase. So what do we do to accommodate this population of people who are out of work and out of wage, but have to go and compete in a marketplace, or have to go and have purchasing power in which just to basically survive? And so I guess, the question is, like, what is the next step, or how soon do we need that step to be able to make sure that people aren't living in completely squalor conditions and starving because we've favored the market instead of favored the population? Population, I suppose.
Well, you're asking, of course, an enormous question, and limits to my expertise and knowledge. One could begin to perhaps approach this by saying, and this is obvious, that as one looks at least toward the left, whether it be what I was just talking about, a kind of traditional mainstream progressivism, or something like a socialism, that the idea would be a cradle-to-grave security, including sort of cradle to either a minimum guaranteed income, it might take that shape, or something like that. By the way, historically in the United States, I mean, even in the heyday of the New Deal and of progressive politics, welfare, as it was called, which didn't mean just, assistance to poor people, but everything, including Social Security, those were all, as we know, tied to labor, right? So the Social Security account is nominally an account based on your employment history. It isn't really that. It really should be a guaranteed universal old age pension. But in fact, even our social welfare programs, such as they have been tied to the successful performance of a lifetime of labor. But so if one could begin to think, but it would, of course, what I'm suggesting, how can it not be obvious in this election season, would seem so anathema to, I suppose, a giant chunk of the country, maybe something approaching half. We seem sometimes to be divided down the middle almost. It's difficult to know how that obstacle could be met. But in other words, this would be the idea that especially if we structurally are moving into decades where there is literally not quite enough work to go around, then clearly there has to be some kind of economic safety net, although I would prefer to use a much stronger word than that, because that implies something that catches you when you fall. But I just mean an institutionalized sense that one's economic necessities are guaranteed. And this would not necessarily mean a homogeneous society, nor even one with nothing that looks like the market or capitalism. It might well be a sort of mixed economy, but just undergirded by cradle-to-grave security, guaranteed health care, guaranteed education, things like that. I mean, that would be, for me, the ideal to work toward. The many myriad steps, how we get there, of course, I don't know how to answer that in any clear way.
Yeah, I think even if we just for now assume that some level of capitalism is fine and moral, I think we certainly need to move away from the state capitalism sort of attitude that's been plaguing our nation since maybe the last 25, 30 years. And I think certain goods and services that are non-liquid, say like food and medicine, the money equation needs to be sort of taken out of these non-liquid goods. And that way, I think, since we will have some type of central government for a long time, that the central government could concern itself with providing its population with, those non-liquid goods, so like clean water and food, and sort of organize communities around just meeting that goal first at the basic level, and then whatever ways we want to like regulate capital or regulate the movement of finances, then that might be like the second priority, not the first priority, which it seems to be